This year is on track to be the second warmest on record, according to Europe's Copernicus climate change service. Scientists warn the world has likely breached critical warming thresholds. At the UN Climate Change Conference in Brazil, nations pledged to triple finance for climate adaptation in developing countries by 2035, though many government commitments still fall short of what experts say is needed. For more on COP30 and this year's climate headlines, let's bring in our panel guest. Joining us here with us in the studio, Seema Wadhwa is a Chief Executive Officer of Net Positive Solutions. She was recognized by Time magazine in 2023 as one of the 100 most influential climate leaders. From London, Isabel Hilton is a visiting professor with King's College in London, and Lisa Sachs is the director of the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment and associate professor at the Columbia Climate School. She too joins us from London. Thank you, ladies, for being with us today. Lisa, let me start with you, if I can. And we'll start by talking about COP30. President Lula from Brazil called it the COP of truth. Many have billed it as the implementation COP, where the pledges of the Paris Climate Agreement a decade ago finally find some real input and real-world action. Did it achieve its goal, in your opinion, and what were some of the key achievements?
Yeah, thank you. I think the main thing that was achieved at this year's COP was the recognition that targets and commitments are not sufficient to deliver on what we know to be the pathways, the goals, and what needs to happen next. So I think the main thing was the recognition that we need actually to address the real constraints and to put in place real proper implementation mechanisms. Some of the most important outcomes of this year's COP were actually some of the papers that were delivered, the Baku de Belém roadmap, the expert report from the International High-Level Expert Group on Climate Finance that outlined very concretely what are the barriers that need to be addressed, what are some of the pathways and the implementation mechanisms that will address the financing barriers, and certain platforms were set up to help advance countries' ability to implement bankable projects. So I think from that perspective, it put us on the right footing for 2026 to actually now move forward to implementation.
Now, how significant was the three Rio conventions as well, that consolidation between climate, biodiversity, and land degradation as far as efficiency?
I would add even one more to that, which is that this agenda, which is the Sustainable Development Agenda more generally, what is really remarkable in this moment is that all of these global goals have aligned in a single compelling approach forward. These are no longer trade-offs, really. There are certain trade-offs that need to be addressed in particular contexts, but really a clean, integrated, sustainable pathway for each region and country is now the most compelling from an energy, affordability, economic security, development, and environmental and climate perspective. So I think the alignment is helpful in that it allows us to think in an integrated way about what those pathways are and how a coordinated approach and coordinated financing pathways can deliver on all of the goals simultaneously.
Okay. Isabel, let me bring you into the conversation and talk about China a little bit, because it's made so many strides when it comes to climate action. And in fact, in the UN pledged that when it comes to 2035, it hopes to reduce greenhouse emissions by between 7 and 10%. Talk about the efforts that it's taking to do that.
Well, this is a very important step in the right direction because China has previously had targets, but they have tended to be things like energy density targets. And whilst that gives you much greater efficiency in terms of your energy production and consumption, the difficulty was that the energy demand was at the same time it was going up very fast. So that didn't necessarily mean that emissions come down. Now, China had pledged that it would peak emissions before 2030, and this is the next step after that. The slightly disappointing thing about the pledge, though, was that it really is not enough. China's emissions need to come down rather faster, and although China has done extraordinary things in terms of installation of clean energy and is largely meeting the increased demand from clean energy, at the same time, in order to bring emissions down, China needs to install clean energy even faster. So, that's the next challenge. Because honestly, if China doesn't bring its emissions down, then we will get to the point where we pass the tipping points, which tip us into a kind of degree of climate change that we can't actually affect by emissions reduction. So it's really critical, as all the reports that went to COP made very clear. We need to do better, we need to move faster, we all need to bring our emissions down faster than we are doing.
And let's talk a little bit about U.S. and the impact on climate action and speak to Seema Wadhwa, bring you into the conversation. U.S. President Trump has called climate change a hoax. He says that he prefers to drill, baby, drill, rather than focus on renewable energy, and failed to send any sort of high-level delegation to the COP summit that we just had in Brazil. So explain the U.S., the impact of the U.S. turning its back on some of its climate action promises and commitments, and then who fills that void?
That's a great question, and thank you for covering this key topic. Essentially, as we look at the U.S.'s role, I think one thing that has become abundantly clear is climate change does not care about politics. The physics, the science behind it rears its face in many different ways, whether that is through financial impacts that we're seeing from climate events. If we just look back to some of the key events that were exacerbated by climate change over this last year, the LA wildfires, Hurricane Helene, Hurricane Milton, all of these events and ones that we're seeing in communities in the U.S. throughout, basically on a daily basis, they are agnostic to what is happening. Maybe not agnostic, but they are not only dependent on what's happening from a political standpoint. So, while it is absolutely disappointing that the U.S., the federal government did not provide any leadership at COP this year, what we did see was leadership from state actors. We know that Gavin Newsom went and represented the great economy of California. The economy of California is the 5th largest economy in the world. So, having that force behind it, and we're actually seeing it not only in California, we're seeing that the lack of engagement on a federal level means there is more innovation happening at a local level. And the reason that's important is the people at the local level are feeling the impacts, whether they're financial impacts, whether they're health impacts, or whether they are job disruption impacts as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And you did mention Gavin Newsom. I want to play you a little bit of sound because he did go to COP with a delegation. Take a listen to what he had to say.
Climate risk is financial risk. It's not complicated. And climate risk is hard to insure. The insurance market itself, which is the housing market, which is the mortgage market, all across the United States is being impacted by the impacts of the hots getting hotter and the dries getting drier. And so we're here to frame it in economic terms, in cost of living terms.
So he framed it, Seema, from an economic standpoint, but climate change has also been framed from a financial and a physical threat standpoint as well. How so?
I think while financial and physical standpoint, one of the elements that adds on to those is the health standpoint. So, and that plays into both the physical and the financial piece. Gavin Newsom talked about the insurance industry and the fact that there are many properties now that are not insurable in the U.S., it is just no longer affordable to live in these places. And, not only is that a reality right now in the real estate market, when we start to look at one of the largest costs for employers in the U.S. is health insurance. So when we have these catastrophic events or these heat events, individuals are going into the ER, individuals are going in for hospital admissions, and those are real material costs. So, we see it on the physical side also with, look at the property losses that happened in LA this last year. We're estimating between 28 billion to over 60 billion. And so these are real material financial impacts that the everyday American is starting to see.
Now, how is that being addressed? Is enough being done?
No, it's very simple. No, not enough is being done. And, you know, I think the opportunity to do more is rising because people are individually being impacted, whether they're being impacted financially, or they're being impacted with their health, or they're being impacted with their livelihood. As we are not moving fast enough, unfortunately, these challenges are going to increase. And I'm optimistic that the pace of action will catch up.
So it's a much bottom-top approach as well as the other way around to get action, real action that will help, you know, better the problem that we're in.
Yes, and you know, the lack of top-down leadership at this moment does not mean things are still not happening. Things are happening, they're just happening in different ways.
All right. Lisa, during COP30, Brazil launched a Tropical Forest Forever facility to help protect forests and eventually hoping to raise up to $125 billion in government and private spending as well. Why is investment so important in our forests, and how could this help with farmers and funding them as well?
Great question, and that was one of the really important outcomes of this COP. If I can just add one sentence to your past conversation, because I think it's really important to note that while I think that the risks are absolutely here and they're mounting, I actually need to be managed and understood for sure. I don't think that it's the appreciation of the risks that is going to drive the financing that's needed in the clean energy economy, just to say. I think that what drives investment in clean energy economy is when those investments are compelling from an economic perspective, they're the most affordable, and they're the most competitive. And that's what we're seeing, by the way, where solar is installed in the US. It's not because of perceived risks, it's because it's the most affordable. And that's true all over the world, and why it's scaling up so rapidly. So I just to say that on the scaling up of the clean finance, I think the imperative for the world is to make those transitions even more affordable comparatively and compelling. And that is the opportunity that China has seen, by the way, and is absolutely developing from an economic competitive perspective all of the technology and the tools that are underpinning the transition. So I just wanted to make that point. But on the forest fund, the recognition of the critical role that forests play in the global climate imperative, because these are not national, even if the forests are located in specific nations, as the forests are one of the most important components of the global climate challenge, because they are one of the most important natural carbon sinks, and they provide tremendous other ecosystem services, and we rely on them for managing our water system, our water balance, never mind also the carbon. So putting them on the table was incredibly important. Also recognizing that they need long-term predictable financing was really important. I'm not sure that this fund structure achieves that, and I think that we're going to see revisions of it shortly, because the payout is too small, the means of repaying financing is too speculative. So I don't think that this mechanism has yet gotten the financing mechanism right, per se. But the idea that we need a blended fund that can finance forests, and both preservation of forests, which also means addressing the real opportunity costs, but also financing afforestation and rebuilding our degraded land in predictable, affordable ways as a global public good. That was very clear in this year's COP, and now we absolutely need to fix the financing mechanism and ensure that the financing is commensurate with the value of the forests to the planet.
And Isabel, China is a global leader when it comes to green energy, be it solar, be it batteries, be it EVs. Can you tell us what you see as the next phase as far as China in their push towards, climate change and clean energy?
Well, domestically, there are already plans for example, a very large expansion in atomic energy generation. There's also, in the planning stage, an enormous hydroelectric dam for the Yalong Sampo Brahmaputra, the Great Bend there, which will produce more energy than the Three Gorges Dam. So, the push continues in across all sectors of technology. Wind and solar will continue, and the upgrading of the grid, which is necessary to accommodate this, the long-term battery storage, the long-term storage in other forms like pumped hydro and compressed air. These are all technologies that are going to continue to develop quite fast. They're all necessary for stabilizing the grid and for continuing to eliminate fossil fuel from the energy generating sector. There are other sectors where things aren't going quite so fast. There are hard to abate sectors, for example, in steel making and in the chemical industry. Those are important in China, and the program for example, making green steel is falling behind. So I think some attention there would be very helpful to China's emissions profile. On the whole, the progress is remarkable, and I can't see China slackening the pace anytime soon.
Seema, we've talked about this, the wildfires, the devastation that was caused there, and around the world, flooding in Asia, heat, extreme heat in Europe. What do we need to do to sort of reframe the way we think about climate change, in your opinion?
I think there's two things. I think, our colleague Lisa highlighted one, and that is shifting the risk into true financial frameworks to really make the case for action greater. But personally, I think one of the greatest opportunities is putting health at the center of climate action. And we think about not only at a individual level, but at a systems level as well. There are compelling financial reasons, but then also at an individual level, people care about the health of their children. People care about the health of their parents and themselves. And when we are seeing, the rates of asthma, we're seeing increases in vector-borne disease, and we're seeing it happening, everywhere across the globe, but at individual levels. I really believe that this may be an anchor to shift climate change from being a political challenge to really being something deeply personal that people are driven to make a change for.
Lisa, I want to ask you really quickly, what are your hopes for 2026 as far as what happens to climate change, and how do we get citizenry to be more involved and keep it at the forefront, particularly at a time when, politics and geopolitics and cost of living are sort of topmost concerns on the mind of many individual people?
Yeah. I think this remains top of mind for most individuals. Our governments, the federal governments, are just out of line. But by the way, at the city level, as we see in New York, the agenda that is most compelling to the citizens is a climate-aligned agenda: resilient buildings, public transport. It is all climate aligned. So I think what we need to do in 2026, and we're on track to do it, is to show how a livable, healthy, economically competitive future is, how that can be done in a clean way, which it can be done. So we need to show the alternative, make it affordable, make it financeable, and then we'll get there. That's the plan for 2026.
All right. And Isabel, last word to you there. What are your hopes for 2026 and COP31? What targets do you want to see met?
Oh, I think much more ambition. We've had a stock take. We know what we need to do. It would be great to see countries returning to their real climate ambition. And it's tough because there are a lot of other claims on the finance, but the cost of not acting on climate is far, far greater than the cost of acting. So I think for people to understand that and push their governments would be a very good development in 2026.
All right, that was a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much. We will have to leave it there. Lisa Sachs, Isabel Hilton, Seema Wadhwa, thank you so much. And for more on commitments made at COP30, we turn now to our next guest, Michael Shank, in his Adjunct Professor of Sustainable Development at New York University. He joins us now from Virginia. Michael, so much for taking the time for joining us. Let me start by just asking you about some of the key achievements you think were achieved at COP30.
One could argue that not a lot was achieved, including the lowest government turnout in the last 10 years of climate talks since the Paris climate talks 10 years ago, and we are celebrating the 10th anniversary of that. So lowest government turnout. I will say that the EU really stepped up. They're already hitting 50% emissions reduction That was a goal for 2030, but they're already there now. They plan to be at 90% reduction by 2040 on their way to net zero by 2050. So that's exemplary leadership in and around COP30 in Brazil. China also committing to some emissions reduction. But there was a new report out today by the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit on the 10th anniversary of the Paris climate talks that showed that we have decoupled economic growth from emissions growth, which is phenomenal. We've long saw it and seen it, but now majority of countries, 90 plus countries, 90% of the world's population now is seeing economic growth decoupled from emissions growth. What does that mean? China, as an example, in the last 10 years saw 50% economic growth, but only 24, 25% emissions growth. So now we can see growth economically without the corresponding emissions growth. So there is some good news coming out this month, but in and around the climate talks in Brazil, we're not seeing the kind of leadership at the national level that we ultimately need to see globally.
And to that point, at the end of COP30, UN Secretary Antonio Guterres posted on X saying, quote, important results were obtained, but it's difficult to reach a consensus in a period of deep geopolitical divide. So evidently, we cannot pretend that COP has delivered everything that is needed. What are some of the opportunities that were missed in Brazil, do you think?
Yeah, so we see a real leadership vacuum among nation states in this climate talk space. And so what they missed in Brazil is perhaps a rethink on the next 10 years of talks and who should we really center in these talks. Maybe it's not nation states because we're not seeing the kind of leadership we need to see. And again, historic low turnout by government officials, including the United States, where only Senator Sheldon Whitehouse was there representing the US government, not in the talks officially, but there as the only sole government representative from Washington, D.C., which is pretty remarkable. And so could we see a different kind of conferencing in the future? Perhaps a conference of a different kind of COP, perhaps a conference of the philanthropists or a conference of the photovoltaic private investors, given that solar electricity is now the cheapest in history and renewables have seen double the investment than fossil fuels have this year. So renewables are seeing twice the investment the fossil fuels. So maybe a conference of the photovoltaic private investors, or perhaps a conference of the prevention security types, given the obsession with immigration and migration into Europe, into North America. Climate change will only worsen those trends, and so maybe we should conference on that. Or a conference of the partners. So these are all COPs of different natures because cities, states, regions, tribes are really where the leadership is happening. It's not at the nation state level. It's among local governments. It's among states, regions, tribes, indigenous peoples. They are the real leaders right now. And so perhaps a different kind of conferencing for the next 10 years is needed.
And Michael, every 5 years, nearly all of the Paris climate signatories, they have to submit these NDCs, the nationally determined contributions. So far, just 121 have come back with those commitments per Climate Watch. How encouraging or not is that?
Well, I'm a professor, so anytime a student turns in their paper late, it's disappointing. And a lot of these NDCs were turned in late and they were poorly written with not so ambitious goals, targets, and timelines. So again, going back to where we're seeing leadership, of course, China's leading outside the NDC in pretty remarkable ways, being the global dominant solar, wind, battery, electric vehicle, heat pump manufacturer and producer. So there's leadership in other areas where, again, these NDCs may fall short. EU, as I mentioned earlier, is leading in the NDC space because already they've met 50% reduction by 2030. And again, they're ratcheting that up to 90% by 2040 and then net zero by 2050. But I think it's worth the climate community reconsidering where we're putting all our eggs. We're putting a lot of eggs in the nation state basket, and perhaps we need to rethink the next 10 years. I was there in Paris at the climate talks 10 years ago, and I helped mayors not only attend the climate talks in Paris, but also meet with the Pope that year in the run-up to the Paris talks. A lot of phenomenal leadership, but now we're seeing threats 10 years later, far-right governments tacking further right and letting go of their climate commitments. And so local governments, states, regions, tribes, that's where the real leadership is happening, and in the markets, like I already mentioned, with China dominating global markets in the renewable space.
And as we see this sort of political polarization that sets in, and different countries, different leaders have different agendas, how do leaders start to rebuild trust in climate policy, and how do we engage more of the citizenry in that?
That's a great question. So the climate talks have usually been about what are we against? We're against climate change. Well, it's hard to rally the publics in something they're against. It's a little easier to rally them in something that we're for. What are we for? We're for more affordability. That's a tongue twister. We're for more affordability. We're for better lives, more enjoyable homes, commutes, heating, cooling, and all of that is possible in the green transition, but we're spending a lot of time pitching what we're against in these climate talks and not what we're for. So I think the more we can center the stories at the local level, where trust is usually higher, around what we're for with real people, real needs, real solutions, the better. Certainly with these floods and fires and droughts that we're seeing in South Asia, Southeast Asia, all the way over to Seattle, Washington State is seeing a lot of floods. These are real people with real needs being impacted in real time by climate disasters. And so pivoting off that awareness, which is usually higher during a climate disaster, to lock in the need for a transition and how our lives will be better. Again, what we're for needs to be messaged loudly and clearly.
Michael, where are we in the climate fight right now? Are we winning and losing? And what are some of the targets you think we need to meet in 2026?
Yeah, so I think we're losing at the global scale when it comes to nation states in these climate talks. Again, historic low turnout by government officials. And in the last 10 years of climate talks, which I usually attend, I've seen waning interest and a lackluster goal setting by nation states. Where we are winning is at the local level. Cities really leading globally in this space, and where I've been consulting over the last 10 years is in this space, though they're seeing attacks too. Some cities like Vancouver, BC is considering letting go of its climate and sustainability department entirely as it makes an effort to cut taxes and cut expenditures at the city level. So it doesn't mean that cities are seeing attacks. They are, and a lot of cities are seeing defunded sustainability departments, defunded climate departments. So the opportunity in 2026, and where I've coached and consulted cities before, is how to embed and bury this work in other departments. And it naturally fits in housing. It naturally fits in a health department. It naturally fits in an Office of Economic Development. All of the things in making our lives better to counter climate change can fit in any of those departments and then is less likely to be attacked. I'm seeing cities and counties bury this work and embed this work in neighborhoods. How do we make our neighborhoods more livable? So there's a lot of opportunity in positioning what we're for. It's going to take some creativity because what has worked in the last 10 years probably won't work as well in terms of messaging, framing, NDCs, and more in the next 10 years. So a pivot is needed.
All right, creative approaches, definitely. All right, thank you so much, Michael Shank, for your insight. We will leave it there.
Thanks, Karina.
And that is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Karina Mitchell in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for watching.